Under my administration, the United States does not torture. We will abide by the Geneva Conventions, that we will uphold our highest values and ideals.
And at the sound of that, the Bill of Rights momentarily stopped turning over and over and over in its very shallow and recent grave. Besides at least saying that he rejects torture, he also says that he will close the prison at Guantanamo Bay, which currently holds about 250 people. Most of them haven't even been charged with a crime. Now, constitutionally speaking, Guantanamo is a huge problem. But, I mean, in addition to Guantanamo, I'm thinking of a much larger constitutional problem. If, you know, the Constitution still applies to this country. I'm starting to wonder if it does or not. I mean, as a proud American citizen such as myself, I'm looking at what our country is doing, and it's going in the opposite direction of the Constitution. But in addition to Guantanamo, back on the topic, my other problem, at the very least, it's a very moral and strategic problem that's about 60 times the size of the problem we've got at Guantanamo. It doesn't really get much attention, but U.S. forces are holding about 15,000 people in jail in Iraq. And like Guantanamo, most of those people haven't been charged with a crime. Now, until last Wednesday, we held those people in Iraq under terms of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council resolution that basically governed the presence of our troops in that country. Now, as of January 1st, that UN resolution thing is over, and the new terms in which we are in Iraq are spelled out in this Status of Forces Agreement. The agreement is just between us and the Iraqis. And the agreement says that we're supposed to hand over all of the prisoners to Iraqi authorities who will deal with them according to Iraqi law. Well, you know what? Fine with me. But here's the important part. Iraqi law doesn't have any provision for holding people without charges. So what happens now? Well, this is the big deal for us. The U.S. military has asked the Iraqis to keep holding at least some of these prisoners without charging them. Never mind the law. The spokesman emailed Reuters news service saying, and I quote, and let me get this right so the Republicans don't have an ounce of substance to go on to get back at me for this. I'm going to get this quote right, so here we go. Let me get it real quick. I'm sorry. We seriously desire that Iraq will choose to keep these detainees off the streets without charges. Did I say that part? Without charges? I think I said that. Well, and how about the part that that's illegal under Iraqi law, but we're asking them to do it anyway? Asking them to adopt our brilliant prison without trial example. Via satellite, for the first time on this show, via satellite, is Jonathan Turley, Professor of Law at George Washington University. Jonathan, welcome to the show. Are we in fact telling the Iraqis to do imprisonment without trial here at our request?
Well, we most certainly are. The interesting thing is that George Bush set out in saying that he wanted to create a nation like ours, and unfortunately, he may be succeeding. I mean, we have achieved the lowest common denominator in terms of a legal system, and we're trying to get Iraq to do the same thing. Remember, this is exactly what George Bush did. He claimed that he had the right on the enemy combatant program or policy to take an American citizen like Jose Padilla, strip him of his constitutional rights, hold him indefinitely, bar him access to counsel and to courts. And so he's encouraging Iraq to do that themselves. And I think what would be interesting is that Iraq could really emerge as a sovereign nation and not some type of mini-me to George Bush if it simply said no and said, you know what? We're going to go our own way here, not your way. We're going to apply the rule of law. Under that agreement, by the way, it clearly states that the prisoners to be transferred would be transferred either under a warrant or a criminal charge, or they would be released. There's no third option. But of course, President Bush has been creating that type of new option in our country as well.
Well, exactly. We've been paying a lot of attention, politically speaking, to Guantanamo. But even in addition to Iraq, there's a whole lot of offshore prisons that the Obama administration has inherited. I mean, I'm wondering, in thinking about the moral and the legal and the constitutional dilemmas, if it's reasonable to expect that some sort of categorical rejection of imprisonment without trial, in the same type that we've heard from Obama in his categorical rejection of torture.
Well, of course, neither Obama nor Bush need to give a categorical rejection. We already have a Constitution that is itself a categorical rejection. And so we don't have to wait to see if Obama is going to recognize what's already in that document. But all of us expect that he will indeed stop these practices. He will close Guantanamo Bay. But the real question is not whether there will be torture in my administration. No one thinks that Obama is going to engage in torture and continue to torture people. The question is whether he will enforce the law and pursue those who did torture people. You know, if the former president was accused of bank robbery, we wouldn't expect the new president, to say, I'm not going to rob banks anymore. We would expect him to say he's going to go and arrest the bank robber. Now, we have to be frank. There's a credible basis here to argue that President Bush and Vice President Cheney have committed war crimes, and that would make them war criminals. And all of this talk about we have to look to the future and we have to not look to the past, well, in our immediate past may be war crimes, and we sure better look at that.
Well, thinking about the prospect of prosecution, it seems likely that the #2 guy at the CIA, Steve Kappas, he'll be staying under Leon Panetta. And Steve Kappas, under his role at the CIA, was at least indirectly in charge of the CIA's secret detention policies. Now, if that's going to be part of what is pursued here, doesn't keeping him in that job sort of preclude the realistic prospect that that will be pursued and exposed and prosecuted if necessary?
That's a very curious thing to do. That's absolutely right. And all this talk about having a truth commission, everything that is coming out of the Congress and the Obama administration is very worrisome. It is not the type of stuff that would be said if you were seriously going to pursue prosecution. But they are insane to try to dodge this issue, because if we don't investigate this administration for war crimes and illegality, particularly war crimes, someone else might. The fact is, the rest of the world sees these as war crimes. How are these people going to travel? What happens when all these Bush officials go off to Paris with their spouses? A lot of the world views them not as tourists, but as war criminals. It'd be much better for us to handle this issue than suffer the indignity of having other nations hold accountable our own leaders.
Well, and us having to suffer the indignity of knowingly letting this stuff go. Jonathan Turley, Professor of Law at George Washington University, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure having you on. And we'll be right back with all of your calls right after this. 22 F.